"No one silences me," shouted the rude prince. Everyone avoided, but the new waitress did the unthinkable. They told her to keep to the shadows and to keep her hands steady. The first command was impossible. There were no shadows in that hall. Light spilled from 100 candles and chased every seam of gold. Gilded cornices grinned down at the long tables. Glasses winked along white cloth like rows of teeth. The smell was rich: roasted meats, orange peel singed by flame, beeswax melting slow. A line of servants hugged the walls, stiff as pillars, breathing when no one watched. Inez stood among them with her tray held high, the weight of a single silver goblet traveling through her wrists and into her ribs. She had never held so much shine on one hand. "At the prince's right," the older maid had whispered at the service door. "No drops, no sound. Bow your head. If he looks at you, you looked too long." She had nodded, because nodding was safe. Speech was not. They said Madrid was cold even in summer, but the heat in that hall pressed against her neck. Sweat made the cap bite into her hairline. She could taste salt when she breathed through her mouth. The palace had a way of making the poor feel they were stealing air. Far above the tables, a painted battle marched across the ceiling. Horses reared, banners unfurled, a prince on a white stallion pointed toward his destiny. The horse was less beautiful than the candles. Inez's path had been shown to her twice in the pantry with spoons set as markers. Out, right, down 3 table lengths, up the side across the carpet, wait at the mark. She moved now as if stepping each spoon in her mind. Right, down, up. She kept the goblet level, watching the surface of the sherry for the first ripple of betrayal. It held as calm as a pond at dawn. Her heartbeat tried to ruin it. She refused to let it. At the far end, the high table rose like a stage. There sat the man all Madrid named with either reverence or caution. Prince Alejandro, his chair high, his shoulders squared as if the back were a command he obeyed for sport. Men beside him leaned close when they spoke. Women down the row glanced toward him and then away, as if sunlight had startled them. He ate very little. He studied everything. "Is that him?" she asked herself, though she knew. It was not only the face, pale, hard, beautiful in the way of marble. It was the stillness under his movements. Even the lift of a finger made people lean. When he blinked, men lower down swallowed. Her road to this hall was old dust. She had climbed stone that did not forgive the poor and doors that did not open for girls like her. A name from Seville meant nothing here unless it came with a title after it. She had only the sound of her own breath to hold. She had 2 hands that knew work. She had a tray and the goblet on it. "Mind the carpet," the older maid had warned. "If you catch your toe in it and it shifts, the steward will bite his tongue until it bleeds and then take it from your skin." Inez saw the line of red woven into the carpet's border. She set her boot precisely where the seam met the stone and lifted, exactly as she'd practiced behind a door, while no one watched but a dead fly and a broom. The weight of watching bodies threatened to tip the tray for her. She wanted to set her jaw and found a better place for her teeth, in the back of her mouth, where clenching could not be seen. A breath moved through the hall, and then stilled. She felt people notice the pause before they knew its cause. A whisper surfaced and died at the head table. Men looked at a piece of paper. A steward corrected someone's position with a delicate cough. The small machine of protocol snagged, caught itself, asked to be forgiven. It would have been nothing in another room. Up on the dais, the prince set his knife down. His hand did not strike. He laid the knife as if placing a boundary. Every eye at the principal table watched his hand as if it were a tide. Inez, 10 paces out, saw a vein at his wrist settle, then lift with his pulse. It made her think of a spring that had been tied shut. She didn't know why. He didn't speak. And then he did. His chair hissed against wood as he rose. The scrape sounded like a threat because everyone knew what followed that sound. He did not look at her. He looked at the steward. at the crust of bread on a plate that should not have been there, at the order misstepped by someone beneath him in the grain of the palace. "Enough," he said very softly. Silence raced through the hall, faster than insects scatter when a lantern is lifted. The last clink of a fork died, embarrassed to exist. A musician held his bow in the air and did not dare let it rest on string. "No one silences me," the prince said. The words were not shouted like a child's. They were cast the way a fisherman throws a net and knows how wide his arms must go to catch a certain quantity of river. Every body that had breath in it held that breath. Even the candles seemed to narrow their flames. Inez's wrist threatened to quiver. She set it. The goblet waited. She was too close to stop. She could not back out. Backing away meant eyes following her forever. Forward meant one thing, her job. The only thing she owned in that room was the task she had been given. Someone brushed her elbow as he tried to make himself small. A footman muttered a prayer into his throat. The carpet did not move. She stepped to the dais. A man with a thin mouth and a ledger at his hip caught her eye and shook his head almost invisibly. She understood that as an order. Return. She did not. She climbed the 2 shallow steps that led to the prince's table. From here, the room looked different. When one sees a sea from a cliff, its surface seems more like a skin and less like something a body can fall into. She imagined falling and did not. The prince's eyes were not on her until they were. When they turned, it felt like the shift in light that tells a storm to begin. She bowed her head. Her cap trimmed the edge of her sight. The tray balanced a long breath. The goblet shone. The silver was old. She could see where fingers had lifted it 1,000 times and not polished away the tiny scratches. She wondered whose lips had used it before tonight. That was a foolish thought. She let it go like a fish too small to eat. "Stop," said the man with the ledger behind his teeth. "Stand back." She did not hear him. She heard only the prince's breath. It was there, controlled, measured. He had learned to turn breath into power. She recognized the lesson without knowing its teacher. He had said, "No one silences me." She brought silence to his hand. She did it with both hands, so the goblet would not tilt. She did it with her spine tall, so no one would say she had snuck or crouched. She set the base of the goblet on the polished wood before him with a faint, pure sound. A note found by chance that makes a musician's ear turn. She placed it where she had been told, to his right. The hall's silence grew another ring. From the other side of the table, a noble shifted his chair and then regretted being the one sound in a room that punished sound. A woman's earring gave a tiny chime when her pulse made it tick the metal of her fan. A guard's hand settled on the hilt he wore by duty, not because anyone intended to use it. The prince looked at the goblet. He looked at the line where silver met table. He looked at her hands. His jaw did not move, but something behind it changed. A moment came when anger could have flowed like a poured drink. It did not. The anger flattened, widened, turned into something less honest and more dangerous. Calculation. His voice went lower. "Who told you to approach?" No one answered for her. She had no breath to form a reply and no permission to use it. The older maid at the wall had told her to say nothing unless asked by the steward. The steward was not the man asking. The prince waited for his own question to have meaning. When it did not, he made a new one. He did not have to speak it. He reached for the goblet. His fingers did not touch hers. They moved close enough that she felt heat. She felt all the blood quit her shoulders and arrive at once in her wrists. She had to resist the urge to pull away as if from a burn. She had known heat since Seville's summer cobbles ate the soles of her shoes. This heat was different. It concentrated the entire hall into the space between his hand and the silver. He lifted the goblet, held it, considered. The servants had filled it to the line. Not a drop dared touch the rim. A man like this could see fault where others saw reflection. He turned the cup a quarter notch. The light on its surface moved over her face and made her flinch. She showed nothing. That took everything she had. He might have smiled if smiling had been his language. It wasn't. "Look at me," he said. There it was, spoken like coin tossed onto a table. She obeyed. The first rule they had given her when she entered the palace was not to meet a gaze unless commanded to do so. The second rule was not to hold it once met. The trap lay between. She met his eyes. He had the kind of face other people describe for you when you are not present, and then you see it and understand that words had been the wrong cloth for it. His eyes were not cold, though people said that. They were sharp and clear and very tired. His mouth knew exactness and punishment better than food. Up close, he was very young. Not in years, in hunger. He let her look for a heartbeat and no more. Then his attention left her as if she were a piece of furniture that had entered the room of its own accord. It should have angered her. The relief was a fall dangerous enough to break bones. The steward tried again. "Your Highness, the toast." "Later," he said. That single word fell like a knife turned flat upon a table. No blood drawn, but everyone saw metal. He did not drink. He set the goblet back in front of him, an inch from where she had placed it. It looked as if he had corrected her. It looked as if he had corrected himself. Inez did not move. She felt how the tray shook against her hip now that her hands were free. She trapped it with her elbow, breathed once through her nose and held. The room did not resume. Time did not roll forward. It held, as if someone had their grip around its throat but had not decided to squeeze. The prince's gaze returned to her. He was not interested in her face, which would have been rude, but ordinary. He looked instead at the place where the goblet had been before and at the exactness with which she had set it down. He looked at her hands. He knew hands. His own had been trained to do a few things very well, and he was suspicious of anyone else's skill in his presence. "What is your name?" he said, and it was not a question. It was a hook. No one had told her to speak. The steward would take a flogging before letting a servant say their name to the prince at table. She could feel the dread radiating out from where the steward stood like heat from an oven. It baked the right side of her face without touching. She opened her mouth. The word rose into it. She closed her mouth. The prince was not testing her. He was testing the hall. He waited to see who would claim authority over her voice. He waited for the steward to jump in, to remind him of the correct route for questions to take through rooms like this. The steward made a small sound like a man biting down on a coin to see if it was counterfeit. He did not speak. Inez heard her own breath, quick, betray her by sound. She made it slow. She looked not at the prince now, but at the goblet, because it was safer. She could read the curve of it as if it were a line drawn on a page. It told her nothing helpful. The prince said nothing. The silence thickened. It had weight now. Men in uniforms traded glances at the edges of the room. Women lowered their eyes and raised their fans as if they had suddenly discovered an emergency of heat. The old maid at the wall had warned her that the prince liked to make a man feel the size of his own throat. She had not believed that a person could do such things before she stood within the reach of it. Then the thing happened that brought her to that moment. It was so small, no word in the hall needed it, but everyone heard it. A fork somewhere clicked against a plate in a way that suggested nerves and not accident. The sound was an insult only because the silence had made it so. The prince tipped his head, not toward the fork, but toward the tray against her hip. She followed the angle and realized her mistake. It was simple and deadly. She had not withdrawn after setting the goblet. She had not melted back into the wall the instant the order ended. She stood in the space beside him, more visible than any servant had the right to be. "Your place is there," he said. He didn't point. He didn't need to. Everyone knew where there was. Her body moved before permission arrived in her head. She took a half step back. The tray nudged her ribs. Her shoulder brushed air that felt like the edge of a knife. She expected to hear laughter. She didn't. She heard only watchfulness. Watching can be kind. Watching can be cruel. This watching offered her a coin she would never be allowed to spend. A man farther down the table coughed. The prince did not allow his gaze to drift. He had her pinned in the simplest way, with patience. The older maid's voice floated back into her bones. If he looks at you, you looked too long. Inez lowered her eyes. She was not bowing to him, she told herself. She was bowing to survival. He spoke to the steward without taking his attention from her. "Train your new staff." "Yes, Your Highness," the steward said, and the words came out like dry bread. The prince chose to stand, then, as if to stretch a tightness from his back. The movement made everyone else react. Chairs twitched. Guards lengthened. A ripple moved out through the hall and came back to center like a tide obeying the moon. His shadow touched her shoes. He stepped around the goblet as if unwilling to put his thigh near it. He came down from the dais with an ease that transformed steps into a slope only he could walk. He stopped close enough that if she reached out she could have touched his sleeve. She did not. He let the room see the shape of what would happen and hoped the shape alone would suffice. Often it did. A threat doesn't lose power when the audience has to imagine the ending. He looked to the right. A guard captain met his eye. The captain measured the distance between his fingers and her elbow. The prince's hand lifted through air as if it were parting curtain. "You," he said, and it was not clear whether he meant the steward, the guard, or the girl who had carried a cup into a storm without spilling a drop. She lifted her chin a fraction, not to defy him, to breathe. He took one more step, and the world in that hall shrank to two people and a goblet, and the distance between them that felt like a drop, and a climb, and a cliff at once. His hand rose, not to the goblet, but toward her. His hand hovered over the space where she stood, not yet a command, not yet a mercy. He felt the hall lean toward his fingers the way a field leans toward a coming storm. He could end this with a nod. He could have the guard captain remove the girl, remove the sound, remove the shape she made in his line of sight. All it would take was the tilt of a wrist everyone watched. He did not give it. He let his palm lower until it marked the air beside her shoulder, not touching, claiming the territory between punishment and restraint. The steward's breath scraped behind him like a knife drawn badly from a sheath. The musicians waited with their bows in the air, caught between the last note and the next. Even the foreign envoys knew better than to cough. "Look at me," he said, not loud, and the order shaped the space like a blade shapes cloth. She lifted her eyes. He found nothing soft there. No trembling he could press into obedience. Only a quiet he didn't own, the kind forged by someone who had stood in lines he had never seen and learned not to thirst in public. It irritated him. It fascinated him more than it should have. "You know where you are," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Highness," came the answer, low, clean. No sidebar plea, no apology offered for the air she occupied. The voice carried without effort and refused to echo. It made a straight path to him and stopped there. The steward took courage from the answer. "She will be removed at once," he said, half turning, eager to perform zeal. His hand flitted toward the girl's arm. Alejandro moved his hand a fraction. That small motion turned the steward to stone. "No," he said. A single syllable, and he felt the bracket of the noble's attention tighten. No one defied him. They rearranged themselves around him. They needed him to be predictable. They needed his fury to be a familiar instrument. Mercy was a stranger to them. It had a way of making debts. He let the silence settle like powder over steel. The girl stood within it, steady. She had set the goblet down with precision. He could respect that. He refused to show it. "What is your instruction?" he asked the steward without turning. "When a servant oversteps." The steward swallowed. "To correct them in the pantry, Your Highness, never at table." "Then you will correct her in the pantry," he said, and the room heard the word pantry and took it as reprieve, though he had not promised one. A murmur rose and ebbed, the court's tide responding to a moon they could not see. A woman at the far left dropped her fan, then swooped down to retrieve it with exaggerated grace, a gesture meant to draw eyes away from the center and toward her. No one looked. The center held. He shifted his attention back to the girl who had set silence in front of him. She kept her head lowered just enough to satisfy the rule and lifted just enough to satisfy herself. She was not ugly. That was not the problem. She was not beautiful in the way that caused men to forget their names. She was exact. Exactness was more dangerous. "You chose not to obey an order to stand back," he said. He let the accusation sit. He let the phrase "chosen not to obey" soak the edges of the moment. "I chose to complete the service I was given," she said. She did not look at the steward. She did not blame. She did not apologize. She stated her task as if it were a ruling. He felt the urge to break something small, something that would satisfy the audience's expectation and his own appetite. A spoon. A rule. A girl. He did nothing. He lifted the goblet and set it down a finger's width from where she had placed it. An adjustment that meant nothing and would be read as everything. "You will not choose again," he said. Her throat moved. The cap bit into her forehead. She nodded once. He watched the nod and saw another kind of obedience beneath it, older than the palace. Obedience to hunger, to winter, to the knowledge that work fed the body and submission fed nothing. He knew something about being fed and not fed. The recognition startled him, too sharp to be pity. The steward found his tongue. "If it pleases your highness, I will—" "It does not please me," he said flatly. He let the man swallow that like a spine he hadn't seen in the fish. The nobles registered the correction, exchanged looks over rims of glasses they weren't drinking from. He could feel the thought form among them like frost. What does he want from a servant who does not flinch? He wanted nothing. He wanted everything to be simple and to end when he said it ended. He had learned young that the only safe hand was a closed one. A ripple of movement along the distant tables teased his attention, and he chose not to look. If he left this moment, others would fill it with their versions. He would give them his. "Back," he said to the girl, with a cadence that left no room for argument. She stepped once, then again. Her tray knocked her ribs and steadied. She would fade into the wall like smoke if he allowed it. He didn't. He brought the silence back hard as a door shut against weather. He wanted the court to feel the hinge. "You will wait," he said, and allowed the line of his mouth to suggest punishment later, and not now. Later was a tool. The musicians, sensing an opening, grazed the strings with their bows. A cautious phrase rose like a bird testing its wing. It did not fly. The hall was not ready. He looked down at the goblet and saw his reflection distorted by the curve. He did not like the man who looked back, his mouth too tight, his eyes too still. He had no time to dislike him. He had work to do. He had a court to prove unafraid of him. He had a father to disappoint in predictable ways. Rage would be faster. Fascination would cost. He let himself look one more time at the servant who had carried calm into the middle of his noise. He let the look last a fraction longer than wisdom allowed. Then he lifted his hand. A gift to the captain of the guard if the man wanted it. A warning to the steward if he needed it. A mercy if anyone knew how to read one, and let it fall useless to his side. He heard his own voice say, without consulting the part of him that liked to crush, "Return to your place." He watched her obey. He watched the court watch her obey. He watched the court watch him. The rumor began before she reached the wall. He could hear it in the softest turn of air, a wordless assessment that traveled hand to hand, fan to fan, like a coin. Weak, some said in their winter-hard hearts. Dangerous, others said in their summer-hot blood. It was neither. It was an act he did not yet understand. He would punish someone later for making him have to understand it. He took his seat. The chair sang that ugly song it always sang when wood rubbed wood. He could feel the reaction of the hall like a pulse he did not own but commanded. He set his hand on the table. The goblet sat in its new place and waited for him to drink and declare the matter dead. He did not drink. He let the steward step forward one pace, a man too eager to collect and arrange the scene like a bouquet on a coffin. He said, "Leave it," and the steward froze again. He knew he was being watched from a dozen angles he had taught them to take. He had instructed them by years of predictable fury. He could see the lines of their expectation and break them if he wished. He wished. He made the room wait without shattering it. He made the room breathe again without forgiving it. He saw the girl reach to adjust the tray against her side, a practical gesture nobody should notice. He noticed. He wished he had not. He wished he were a man whose attention stayed on things that mattered. He wasn't. He watched the tray tilt a hair. He watched her elbow make room. He watched her hand slip, not on the silver but on herself. A minute chain beneath the tie of her apron snagged. He saw the tug, the tiny pull that turned metal into sound, sound into signal. The link yielded with a softness only she felt. Something small and oval slid free from the warmth against her skin and swung. He was on his feet before he thought about it. His hand moved faster than anger. He caught the pendant before it struck wood. The hall breathed in a single sound like a living thing. He felt the weight of it in his fingertips. A piece of polished silver, oval, old. He felt the chill off its surface. He turned it, not enough to betray curiosity to those who fed on it, enough to face what only his eye could see. On its face, a device. Cypress. Star. A motto that the palace no longer carved, and that the city no longer spoke in public, because language, like kings, goes into hiding when it grows inconvenient. His chest tightened. He had not seen those curves in years. He had not forgotten them. He saw a chip, fine as a crescent scraped from the moon. He remembered the velvet-lined box in a cabinet that had not been opened since the day too many things were put away at once. He did not move for half a heartbeat. He made himself move, because if he did not, someone else would. He placed the pendant on the girl's tray, rather than hand it back across that dangerous distance to her body. He let his fingers leave it with care he did not want anyone to read. He did not look at her. He could feel her, the way one feels a doorway behind one's back. "Attend to your line," he said to no one in particular, and the words sounded like order and felt like refuge. He sat. He did not feel the seat. The goblet watched him. The pendant's oval watched more. A rustle. Not the musicians, not the servers. The rustle of feathers and silk and men with memories. An older noble, whose bones remembered more reigns than his tongue would admit, drifted 2 steps from his chair with the ease of a man pretending his joints were free. He moved toward the tray and its illegal brightness the way a man moves toward a fire left unwatched. His hand rose in a question. The steward regained his sense of importance. "Return to your place, sir," he said, scandalized for the wrong reason. He stepped between, all urgency and no authority. The older noble did not hear him. He pretended not to. He was a creature who had long practiced the art of ignoring men with ledgers. His fingers spread. They hovered over the pendant as if calling a lost falcon down. Across the table, a lady lifted a lorgnette to her eye and dropped it when she remembered where she was. A younger man leaned forward, mouth ajar, the picture of curiosity made vulgar. Alejandro did not rebuke the old man. He did not invite him. He made the hall watch a line be crossed that could not be uncrossed. Secrets are not killed. They are shown the light until they either heal or die. He felt the heat run down his spine with a familiarity he did not welcome. Recognition is not comfort. It is a set of shackles that fits too well. The old noble's thumb touched the silver and turned it, slow, reverent, as if he were blessing or cursing something only he believed in. He lifted it, heavy enough to mean something, light enough to carry, and the etched device caught a feather of candle fire and made it into speech. Inez had told herself to remember air. She had thought, when the prince's hand rose a breath from her shoulder, that this would end in the way things always ended for girls who were seen in the wrong light. A short march, a door, a lesson. Instead, he had stood so close to her that she felt the edge of his shadow on her shoes. He had said words that sounded like later, and meant now. He had sent her back and pulled her forward at the same time. That was what power did. It made distance into a trick. She went to the wall without seeing it, guided by the fact that she could go no further. The tray sat warm against her hip. Her fingers found their hold without looking. She whispered nothing to herself. The body knows its instructions when the head is full of sparks. She kept her eyes level. Not down, not up. The place where a servant could see without seeming to see. At that level, she saw hands. Hands told the truth in rooms where mouths wore masks. The prince's hands did not shake. They were educated into stillness. When they moved all the way. She had learned to read that in men who hit and in men who worked a plow. There was no gap in his gesture. It was a road, not a stumble. He told her to wait, and she did. Waiting filled the space between her ribs like water filling a jar. She could feel the gaze of the hall travel over her and move on, hunting better prey. It found the steward. It found the prince. It found the cup. It began to forget her. She let it. Then she felt the mean bite of fabric against skin, a pull where no one else would feel it. The apron tie that had felt harmless had turned. The chain she wore against her chest snagged. She felt the scratch of metal at her breastbone, the wrongness of slack where there should be rest. She had worn the pendant since she was old enough to be told its story in whispers, fit for a girl's ear. She had been warned to keep it hidden when work required bending, leaning, reaching. Hidden meant safe. Hidden meant hers. She shifted the tray to free the pressure. The movement was nothing, a correction made 1,000 times in markets and kitchens. Today, the chain did not forgive. It snapped. No sound, just the sensation of something stopped now falling. She caught air. The pendant swung out, betrayed by light. Her hand shot to catch it, but she checked herself. To reach into her own bodice at the high table would be to die by humiliation. Another hand reached faster. The prince's. His fingers closed on the oval like a trap made of velvet. He held it just long enough for heat to move from her to him. He had not asked permission. He had not taken what was not his. He had prevented a new sound in a room that punished sound. She did not know whether to thank him. She saw his eyes fall to the silver. She saw the distance travel between what he saw and what it meant. The change was small, a breath he did not take, a nerve under the skin of his cheek. He had recognized something. Men like him did not often recognize the poor. They recognized their own. He set the pendant on her tray. He did not return it to its nest under her apron. He placed it where it could be seen and not ignored. The act felt like both protection and exposure. She kept her hand steady, because any movement now would be a confession. The court smelled blood. It moved without moving. Necks lengthened, eyes sharpened. She saw the people who had waited all their lives to use a fact against someone else without understanding what the fact was. An older noble detached from his place with the lax grace of a man whose joints ached when rain was coming. He approached the tray as if he had every right to do so, and simply had not exercised it until now. His face belonged to the past. His gaze belonged to accounting. "Sir," the steward said, voice thin, "this is irregular." So was everything that mattered. The noble smiled a little to show that his teeth, too, were instruments. He extended his fingers. She could have moved the tray back into the safety of the wall, but that would have been disruption, and disruption would have been assigned to her as guilt. She held her ground. She held his eyes as long as the rule allowed. She shifted them to the prince when the rule demanded it. The prince watched. He let the scene assemble itself in front of him. Control does not always shout. Sometimes it waits to see who reveals themselves without being asked. The noble's thumb pressed the edge of the silver and turned it with care. The chain clinked against the tray, a tiny bell no one should have heard and everyone heard. He lifted the pendant between finger and forefinger with the delicate violence of curiosity. He was not a thief. He was a man who believed the past belonged to him. A woman near the dais tilted her head to taste the air of scandal. A man coughed into his fist as if that would disguise his interest. The musicians did not play. The drums that had sounded like hearts earlier now sounded like silence wearing skin. Inez stood inside a small circle she had not chosen, its border drawn by eyes. She did not flinch. She had been taught in the streets that flinching is a tax paid to strangers. The prince did not speak. He did not stop the noble. He did not look away. The aristocrat held the pendant high enough to catch the chandelier's light. He turned it just once so the image engraved on its face flashed legible and bright to those close enough to matter. The steward stepped forward at last, hand raised, mouth opening to reclaim shame in the name of propriety. But the old man's arm was already up, and the oval of silver, lit and sudden, made a new silence that pulled every gaze toward it, as if the whole room were a weight on a single chain. The oval of silver hung at the exact height to catch the chandelier's cruel light. It glared, and the room flinched. Alejandro watched the old noble's hand turn, watched history rotate between finger and thumb like a coin that buys sins. Watched a device he knew better than his own crest flare once, twice, as if it were breathing. "Lower it," the steward hissed, nerves ahead of sense. The old man ignored him, because men with long memories treat stewards as furniture. He twisted his wrist just enough to show both faces. The cypress, with its thin trunk, carved too fine for a cheap copy. The star flared with 5 points and a tiny nick at the base as distinctive as a scar. Alejandro felt the nick in his teeth. He had touched its missing piece as a boy when no one was watching. He had been told not to ask questions that would not improve with answers. A murmur crept along the tables, the kind that hides inside clothing and comes out at throats. Fans rose like small shields. Men leaned, calculating whether to claim knowledge or plead ignorance. Across the lower floor, the orchestra bowed a single startled chord and fell mute. The timing was perfect by accident. Silence thickened and took a chair among them. Alejandro left his seat. He did not leap. He descended the dais with that steadiness he had trained in yards that smelled of sweat and iron, and exercises meant to tame a boy into a blade. Each step took him farther from the law of spectacle and closer to the danger of meaning. He crossed the small space the steward could not guard, the space where an object and a servant and a prince made an unadvised triangle. "Enough," the steward said again, voice at the pitch of linen tearing. Alejandro did not look at him. He came to the old noble's side and let the man feel his presence as one feels a shadow enter a room. The noble's shoulder dipped half an inch, unwilling to bow, unwilling not to. Alejandro paused there, allowing every eye to count the beats. He took the pendant, not with a snatch, not with softness, with a precision that returned the room to law without killing the air. He set the oval on the tray where it belonged, because he had decided it belonged there now. He did not hand it back into hiddenness. He neither hid it, nor gave it away. He let it exist. A tiny scrape signaled the master of ceremonies at the rear recovering his baton. The man lifted it as if it weighed more than wood. Alejandro inclined his head a fraction. Permission, command, cover. The bows touched strings. A waltz, slow and civil, grew like a patch of grass over stone. "Play," Alejandro said under his breath, and the word gave the musicians their spine. The dance floor unfurled, not in confidence but in obedience. Couples rose because movement is safer than sitting still with fear. They curved around the center where blood might be. The patterns learned in safer years survived on muscle memory and habit. A woman laughed too loudly, and the sound broke in the middle. Men guided women into turnings that kept their faces outward, hunting the center with their eyes as their bodies pretended to enjoy the measure. He stood one pace back from the tray, and the servant who held it, watching the circles widen. In the circle closest to him, he recognized a certain kind of closeness. Aristocrats with the bad habit of having buried a thing together. Their mouths did not move much. Their eyes moved like knives under tablecloths. He read what he could. He made a note of which hands twitched at the old device. People who thought secrets dead were always wrong. Secrets lay underground with breath to spare. He leaned toward the steward just enough to make the man earn his station. "You will not touch it." "Your Highness," the steward said, greedy for instruction, greedy to erase the last 5 minutes, "her presence at the high table is under my sight," Alejandro said. He did not raise his voice. It cut the steward's eagerness in two. The man stepped back so fast his heel kissed the leg of a chair. Alejandro let his gaze return to the girl. The tray steadied against her hip as if it were the only fixed thing in the room. She had not tried to reclaim the pendant. She had not moved to hide. The eyes he had ordered to look at him once now looked straight ahead, because that was the rule, and also because she had decided it would be her rule. The tightness at the corner of her mouth could have been fear or discipline. He chose to read it as discipline. It irritated him again that he could not reduce her. Around them skirts swept, boots rasped. The dance made noise enough to cover a quiet knife. He felt the whole labor to become normal. Normal was a costume. He watched the costume fail. He placed 2 fingers on the edge of the tray and shifted it a hair deeper onto the flat of her hip. The pressure was light. He left it there the barest fraction of a breath. It was nothing. It was scandal. He removed his hand and pretended to be bored. "Let them dance," he said to no one, and to everyone. Behind him, the captain of the guard drifted along the walls, placing men with the same quiet one uses to put a baby to sleep. Alejandro did not give him orders. The captain knew what needed catching if it fell. The prince's neck prickled. The room was about to grow teeth again, only not from where most expected. He felt it more than he saw it, a new current at the far door, the particular draft that enters with power cloaked as duty. He turned slightly. He recognized the figure by posture and the men who flanked him by uniform. The state had arrived to correct the court. He kept his face empty. He did not go to meet the minister. He let the minister come into his air. The pendant burned on the tin like a small moon. The waltz began to move like weather people pretend not to notice as they cross a square, a storm too far to seem real and too near to ignore. Inez stood at the wall with the tray mapped into her body like a third arm. Sound came in layers now. Fiddle bow, whisper, shoe. The thread of music ran under the fabric of voices that tried to be soft and failed. "Do you see?" Someone breathed too near her ear. Not to her, but to someone she would never meet. "The cypress. It was on the—" "Hush," came the answer, the S on the end like a blade. She did not turn. She watched hands. On the measure of the dance, gloved fingers brushed, parted, found each other again. The elegant surface fractured under the pressure of looking. In eyes, she saw memories that had been sleeping wake up like cats. In the lift of a chin here and the dip of a shoulder there, she saw a story she did not yet have words for, because the poor are given crumbs of information and told to make silence out of them. The pendant sat in the middle of her tray like a law laid down without ink. She could feel the exact place where the chain had broken, a ghost of pressure where metal had bitten skin. Under the apron tie, warmth gathered, a blush that was not shame. She had been touched and not touched. The prince's fingers had arrested the fall and refused the intimacy of return. He had placed the oval in the light so no one would pretend it did not exist. She hated him for the way her heart answered that choice with relief. She hated him less than she had expected. A couple turned so close she could smell their perfume and their fear. Orange blossom, wine, a faint sourness that comes when someone wears too tight shoes for too many hours. The woman lifted her lorgnette, eyes bright. The man tried to steer her away from her own curiosity and failed. The lorgnette flicked down as if the muscles behind it had recalled manners. The pair swept off and left the scent of their small lives behind. The steward hovered, made of nerves and polished buttons. He had been braver in the pantry when ordering girls like her to move faster. In public he wore caution like a cloak that didn't fit. He kept glancing from the prince to the pendant, to the circle of older men whose mouths thinned at the edges. He did not know whom to displease. Inez had learned at 8 that not knowing whom to displease is a luxury the poor cannot afford. You displease no one by becoming heir. Tonight, she could not. The music found a little confidence and widened. Skirts took up space. Men pretended to calculate their next partnership when all of them were calculating whether this moment would sprout thorns. Across the floor, a woman in green raised her hand, too slow to be spontaneous, and a boy from the pages sprinted to the door with a message. The boy ran like he had been trained, eyes down, letters worth a year's bread in his fist. He disappeared through the drapery. Inez worked her jaw against the dryness that came when fear took water out of the mouth. She did not lick her lips. She made herself swallow as if tasting soup. She placed her weight in both feet and loosened her toes in her shoes to remind herself that she had a body. The pendant grinned at her in its small way. The chain coiled like a question mark. She let one thought rise because pushing all down can choke a person. My mother's hands held this. She set the thought on the tray beside the silver and did not touch it again. The hall's temperature changed, as if a door had been opened. A smell of night air braided itself with wax and sweat. Power came in on quieter shoes than soldiers usually wear. Before Inez saw the man, she saw people move for him without thinking. Not the prince. The others. The sort of man who writes down what is decided and makes that writing into iron. The minister appeared with 2 guards in darker green than the palace men wore. Their hats were plain. Their faces were already bored, which is another kind of threat. They took in the scene without appetite and measured the distance to the tray with eyes used to measuring distance to danger and to pay. The music tripped, then tried again. It could not decide whether the room wanted to dance or not. The room wanted to watch. The minister stopped short of the dais and bowed to the shape of the prince above, enough to prove he remembered the lines of the play, not so low that he surrendered the scene. His gaze found the pendant within a heartbeat. His gaze found her in the next. He did not linger on her face. He tallied her. He had tallied 100 like her, and ordered 10 to be removed with a word. It took nothing out of him. "Your Highness," he said gently, in a tone that meant roughness elsewhere. "A matter for quiet consideration." The steward seized on the phrase quiet consideration, like a drowning man finds a plank. "She has interrupted. We have eyes," the minister said, and cut him off with a smile that did not reach his cheeks. "There is no need to recite." Inez kept still. If she shifted her weight now, someone would call it confession. If she blinked too slow, someone would call it insolence. She found the point between and stood on it like a bird on a stalled wind. The minister nodded toward the 2 guards. "Bring the object and the girl. We will straighten the thread in the proper room." He made straightening sound merciful. The room knew what it meant. Removal. Interrogation soft as butter in the mouth, hard as iron on the teeth. The guards did not turn their heads toward the prince before stepping. They obeyed state before spectacle. Their boots measured so exact a rhythm that for a sick instant they matched the waltz. Then the music went silent again, as if out of respect for what law does to music. Inez felt their approach before sound declared it. Heat gathers when men in uniforms narrow the space around you. The air lost its taste. Her fingers wanted to fly to the chain and coil it out of sight. She left them where they were. She looked at the prince because she could not look. He stood half off the dais, near enough to touch the edge. His face had cooled into that expression she had seen once on a butcher before he set the knife down without cutting. Decision. He did not move. He could have spoken. He didn't. He was a man who knew when his voice did damage and when his silence did worse. She hated him for being both kinds of man at once. The minister turned a fraction to make it seem he had sought the prince's eye and found permission there. He had not. He made his own permission. He was a man trained to make permission out of silence. "On suspicion of theft," he said in a voice that pretended to be careful, "and of posing as what she is not." The words theft and posing clinked together like cheap metal. Inez absorbed them. She could defend the first with the truth that the pendant had been hers to keep hidden and guarded by a story she could not spill in public. She could not defend the second with anything this room would hear. Posing as what? A person. A woman who could stand at a high table and not beg. The thought felt dangerous enough to make her swallow quickly. Too quickly. A pair of ladies nearby made a synchronized sound like pity and hunger mixed. The men at their back stiffened in the particular way that means they are relieved something is happening that is not their fault. One of the guards, the taller, came to her left. The other stopped at her right. They did not yet touch her. That restraint was strategy. Touch too soon, and a prince's pride might rouse. Wait, and the room would tell itself the story that this was reasonable. She understood it. She had watched dogs circle a bone until the bone forgot itself. The steward chose his side without knowing he had, took one step toward the minister's shadow, and tried to make himself look smaller than the law he was hiding under. He had the talent to become a noun when verbs became dangerous. Inez had no such talent. She had breath and bone and a tray and the weight of an oval that might be the key to a door or the stone tied to an ankle. Her eyes slid to the prince again. His had slid to hers first. For a heartbeat, without permission, they held. It should have been nothing. It felt like being thrown a rope across a span she could not jump. He did not smile. He did not frown. He dropped nothing. He lifted nothing. He watched, and in the watching made a promise that had no words attached yet. She told herself she had imagined it. Imagination was cheaper than hope, and less likely to leave a scar. Someone near the center said very softly, "Finally," with the satisfied cruelty of a person who likes endings as long as they belong to other people. The minister extended his hand toward the tray, palm up, patient as a spider. "Give it," he said, and decorum primed the room to hear the request as kind. Alejandro swallowed the cold taste of ink. He hated the sound of the minister's voice when it called itself careful. Careful is the voice of men who have decided a thing already. He felt the old itch to break a table so that a new one would have to be found. He did not move. He took the measure of what would happen if he moved now, in front of the watching. He saw the narrative slip from his grip and clatter into everyone's. He chose a slower lever. He would move the scene into a room made for decisions and away from this place that turns every act into song. But the scene did not ask to be moved. It stayed rooted. The guards took their next half step. The prince's hand lifted a fraction, the smallest tide in the world. The captain of the guard noticed it and shifted his stance. The minister noticed the captain and altered nothing. Alejandro saw, with the clarity that comes when a blade edge sits at your throat, and you are very calm, how thin the line was between a court's game and the state's hand. He would have to speak in the next breath or not at all, and both choices would change 5 years. A courtier breathed, "Will he?" to someone who did not answer. A woman pressed a knuckle to her lower lip until it blanched. The waltz died again without apology, strings dangling like thoughts that had lost their way home. The guards angled in with a precision trained for other rooms, other nights, other corridors. The captain's men along the wall narrowed their eyes like cats deciding whether to pounce. The steward made the sign of the cross against scandal and then pretended he was smoothing his coat. Alejandro felt the floor tilt under him a hair and held himself level by force of habit. He tasted wax in the air and the ghost of orange peel and the salt that comes off a woman's skin when she is brave. He opened his mouth. He did not get a word out before the guard's hands came up, not quite touching, and the space between their fingers and Inez's elbows shrank to inches. The space between the guard's hands and her elbows closed to a breath. Alejandro stepped into it. He did not shove. He did not need to. He set his body where authority lived and spoke in the old cadence of ceremonial law, the one that sounded like velvet and cut like wire. "By the rule of the high table," he said, his eyes on the minister, not the guards. "Those who serve it fall under my protection until the feast concludes." The minister's smile flickered in the center and remained on the edges. "Protection is not immunity, Your Highness. Nor is impatience a warrant," Alejandro answered. He did not raise his voice. He lifted his hand a fraction, and the captain of the guard understood, easing his men a step back without losing the line. The steward made a hopeful noise. Alejandro silenced it with a look. "Music," he said, and the master of ceremonies brought his baton down as if it weighed a stone. Violins obeyed. The waltz returned in a quieter key, a cloth thrown over a hot pan. "Walk," Alejandro said, and the word contained the command and the path. He did not take Inez's arm. He moved beside her, a pace that made room without giving way. The minister fell in on the other side with his pair of green-coated men. They traveled down off the dais and across the floor, cut with dancers who parted as if a tide had remembered how to be useful. Fans dropped, heads dipped, eyes followed. No one reached out. The space around them puffed and pulled like a bellows. They passed under a chandelier that sighed with heat. They passed a lady who smiled with all her teeth. They passed an old noble who kept his eyes on the tray and its oval, as if he could pull it back with wanting alone. At the edge of the hall, the steward scuttled ahead, tripping over his own eagerness to open the carved door that led to the antechamber, where rank quarreled politely about precedence and old heraldry. He bowed so low his balance nearly betrayed him. Alejandro ignored the bow and the man. Inside, the air cooled by a degree that felt like forgiveness. The candles here stood shorter, thicker, burned steadier. A long table rubbed to a dull glow by a century of elbows anchored the room. A crucifix hung crooked on the far wall. The door shut behind them with a sound that declared privacy and warned against lies. Alejandro let the first breath out, not relief, adjustment. He faced 3 men at once without moving his head. The captain, the steward, the minister. "Witnesses," the minister said, not asking. As a clerk with better penmanship than conscience stepped sideways through the door with a portfolio and the self-importance of paper. He did not sit. He did not need to. He was the sort of man who believes his ink outweighs your memory. Alejandro nodded once. "2," he said. "No more." The captain opened the door and summoned the old noble with a glance. The man entered with the care of someone who had spent a life walking on glass and not bleeding. Alejandro gestured to the other side and pointed at the far corner. "The housekeeper," he said. The steward startled, then scuttled out and returned with a woman whose keys hung heavy from her waist, noise and authority in a common string. She did not look at the prince. She looked at the table and measured what kind of mess would have to be cleaned here. Inez stood with the tray steady at her hip. The pendant lay expectant on the tin. She had not moved it. She had not breathed on it. She could feel the reach of the minister's gaze like a draft. "Sit," Alejandro said to her, and when the steward protested with his eyebrows and not his mouth, the prince added, "No one falls down in my rooms." The chair, a hand's span behind her, blessed her legs without making her small. The tray found the table and made only one sound, a clean tick that sat nicely with the candles. The minister did not sit. He leaned with elegance against the table's edge and arranged his face for care. "We have a trinket and a fuss," he said, as if the naming might shrink the thing. "Let us peel them apart." Alejandro took the oval and turned it once, without showing the minister more than he needed to see. He put it down in the center of the table. He pointed at the keys at the housekeeper's belt. "The registers," he said. "Household gifts. Charities. The year of the South's flood." The housekeeper glanced at the steward, then at the prince, then at the minister. She chose her answer and lived with it. "Yes, Your Highness." The steward half lifted his hand. Perhaps a closed inquiry. "It is." Alejandro said, cutting him cleanly. He gestured at the two witnesses. We have walls enough and eyes enough. The old noble settled into a chair as if it might remember a story better than he did. He kept his hands folded on the table to prove he would not steal the pendant in plain sight. Inez listened to the phrases like a person catching shapes on a surface of water. Gifts, charities, the South's flood. She knew each word. Together they made a sentence she had not yet read. It cannot be the same, the steward said softly, more to himself than to anyone. It cannot. Then let us prove it, the minister said, tone agreeable, meaning the opposite. Keys chimed. The housekeeper disappeared and returned with 2 ledgers in raw boards, bound with iron corners. They were heavy. The smell that rose from them was mildew, ink, and a year when candles had smoked more than they should have. She laid them on the table with respect people reserve for weight and the past. The clerk with his careful hands opened one and licked a finger to turn pages faster. He began where the housekeeper's blunt thumb had found a ribbon. Columns lined themselves in neat rows: date, donor, recipient, object, purpose. Money appeared in numbers that could have fed a street for a month and did not. Names appeared for whom the poor do not ring bells. Here, the housekeeper said, the month after the river climbed into the streets. The clerk read in a schoolroom voice. Donation to Convent of the Sorrows. Blank line here. Notation. Private carriage arrived at night. Crest unrecorded, instructed by... He stopped because the line had been scraped with a knife and written over with a safer sentence. The ghost of the old words clung. Alejandro felt the scrape like an ache at the back of his mouth. The court has a way of trimming away what doesn't fit the costume. He did not reach to touch the scar in the paper. He did not need to. He knew the sound of cleaning too well. The housekeeper cleared her throat in the span, after a memory surfaces, and before fear makes it sink again. The late princess consort, she said, and she said it like a confession. She kept her charity where it would do its work, and not its bragging. She sent what she could when the South drowned. Sometimes it was money. Sometimes it was... She nodded at the oval. That. A sign to open doors that would not open for the poor. The minister's eyes narrowed the way a man does when tasting a dish he recognizes, but wishes he did not. And your steward recorded none of this, he said, without shifting his gaze off the ledger. The steward whitened. It was not for the books, the housekeeper said, because some gifts grow thieves when you count them. Or scandals when you name them, the old noble added, dry, as if his own tongue had been scraped once too. Who put the knife to this line? Alejandro asked, and the question landed like a coin before a beggar, meant to be picked up, dangerous if you don't. The housekeeper stared at the page. The hand looks like mine, she said, voice small. The mind did not. And the mind? The minister asked. She hesitated, then lifted her chin the way a woman does when she remembers her own dignity. I was told, she said. I obeyed so I could continue to bring bread to where bread mattered. I was told by a man who spoke for men, who do not have to say their names twice. She did not look at the old noble. She did not look at the minister. She looked at the crucifix hung crooked, and did not ask forgiveness. Alejandro felt rather than saw Inez's shoulders tighten and then soften under the cloak of the chair. He watched the way her hand rested near the edge of the table, fingers open, palm lifted as if it were asking a blessing and did not expect one. Where was the pendant before it found its way to her? He asked. In a box with a few others, the housekeeper said. Enough to protect a handful of souls who had the bad luck to be born at the wrong door. And the other half? The old noble murmured, more to the air than to any man. Cabinet, west corridor, second shelf, Our Late Lady's keepsakes. He made his voice bland after and watched the prince from under old lashes. The minister's good manners folded neatly around a sharpness. We have no need to rummage tonight. Alejandro turned his head a degree, and the room understood that sentence would not stand. Send for the key, he said, and cut off the minister's other sentence with his eyes. "If there is a peace, I will see it. We will not wake an entire ballroom tomorrow with a guess." He gestured to the steward, who blanched at being given a task he could not perform with malice. "A page," Alejandro added, softer. "The library holds the cabinet key." The steward snapped 2 fingers for a boy at the door. The page ran, quiet as he could, the way boys do when speed matters and attention hurts. The minister smiled again, without meaning it. "Your Highness could have ended discomfort with a nod out there," he said amiably. "Now we assemble rooms and records, invite witnesses to recall their own misdeeds, and place ourselves in debt to fact. It is a brave habit. It produces enemies." "It produces clean air," Alejandro said. "I find I breathe better in it." The clerk hunched over the ledger. He copied the scraped line as it was, then penciled the ghost words into the margin where he pretended no one would read them and everyone would. Inez sat with her hands quiet and let the sound of turning paper calm her. The ritual of writing had a kindness the dance had lacked. Words stayed where they were put. Bodies had moved where they pleased. The prince stood near enough that if she lifted her hand, she could have touched his sleeve. The thought shamed and steadied her. She remembered the way he had placed the goblet. She remembered the way he had not taken her arm, but had made space for her to walk. She could not guess whether any of it belonged to mercy or to pride. The poor do not get to distinguish. They take the path a man cuts and hope it does not lead to a pit. "Your name," the minister said, turning to her with courtesy that tasted of iron. "For the record." She let her gaze meet his and then drop. She did not look to the steward for permission. He had lost any claim on her speech when he raised his hand behind her back and lowered it again at the prince's breath. "Inez," she said, "from Seville." "A surname," he said. Her mouth opened. It closed. The story of her name belonged to a mother's lips and a courtyard where laundry snapped and men with time on their hands told lies to each other. It did not belong to this table. "I have my mother's," she said. "I have not been allowed to use it." The minister's curiosity had a professional weight. "And the pendant?" "It was mine to keep and not show," she said. "I was told what it meant, enough to stay safe. I was told the rest would not fit in a girl's head." She let the line sit. Men in rooms like this preferred girls with empty heads. Let them decide whether to be angry with the ones who told her. He considered that, and filed it under a label that would serve later. "Who told you to keep it?" "A woman who left in the night," she said. "It was the truth, and not the whole. Who asked me to remember the feel of it, not the look." The old noble's fingers tightened on each other. He had seen that departure in another house, perhaps. He had pretended not to. The door opened with a draft and a key. The page came, breathless, with an older silver key on a loop. He handed it not to the steward but to the prince, because the boy was clever and had learned quickly which hands tonight turned locks. Alejandro fit the key to the box brought from a narrow cabinet set into the room's wall. The lid gave with the soft reluctance of old wood. Inside, a velvet nest held the kind of things people keep when they cannot bury what should not be worn: a brooch with a broken pin, a scrap of ribbon faded to a color that might have been blue, a bit of silver shaped like a crescent. He lifted the fragment and set it on the table near the pendant without letting them touch. The housekeeper's breath hitched. The old noble's face for an instant lost its practiced blandness. The minister leaned. Alejandro touched neither piece to the other. He would not give the satisfaction to a room that liked to gasp. He studied the edge of the fragment and the nick on the pendant's base, teeth finding their socket. He could see the fit as easily as he could see cause and effect. He did not move. "We will not repair what we do not yet understand," he said. "Prudence," the minister murmured, by which he meant delay. He saw now that he would not pocket this privately. He recalculated the cost. Alejandro turned to the clerk. "Copy this page," he said, indicating the ledger. "You will sign across your copy and the original. The housekeeper will sign. The minister will sign. The steward will watch and remember that wax seals are not food." The steward flushed, then shrank into his role like a man trying to find a smaller version of himself. "Your Highness intends to make a public account," the minister said. Alejandro let him see that, yes. "In the morning," he said, "in the audience gallery. Not here where hunger eats memory, not there where the band turns truth into entertainment." The minister lifted his brows in a shape that meant he might agree because he could not prevent. "You risk giving rumor a stage and a conductor." "We risk less with light than without it," Alejandro said. He placed the fragment back into the velvet and closed the lid. He set his palm on the lid, not to hide, to claim. Paper scratched. Wax warmed against flame. The clerk melted a puddle and dropped it in precise circles, then pressed the signet the prince wore into the first and lifted clean. He offered the seal to the minister, who let the ring he wore mark the second with state authority. The housekeeper pressed her rough fingertip into the third. The ledger remembered all of them and promised to tell the story straight if asked kindly. Inez watched the small theater of ink and wax and recognized it as a cousin to the rituals of kitchens and markets. Heat, measure, pressure, patience. Very little truth requires more than that. The prince looked at her, not as he had in the hall with a blade behind his gaze, but as one looks at a person who stands where your habits have been. His mouth almost made something that, in another man, would have been a smile. He did not let it arrive. He lifted the pendant and held it out, chain coiled, open palm. "Keep it," he said. "Here?" she asked before she could stop herself. "Here," he said, and when the minister inhaled as if to object, Alejandro added, "Nothing dishonorable occurs while I am in the room." It was a line drawn for many ears, not just hers. She stood and took the chain with the caution one uses to accept a hot dish, swift, sure, grateful to the nerve that doesn't burn. She did not slip it under her apron. She set it in the bowl of her palm and let it rest there, a weight that felt like an anchor more than a shackle. The minister gestured at the steward as if to remind him he still existed. "Your staff," he said, with a mildness too careful, "will be directed not to improvise." "They will be directed," Alejandro said, and looked at the steward as one looks at a tool that will be moved from one drawer to another. "Your Highness intends changes," the minister said, and tested the word. Alejandro did not disagree. "Your office," he replied, "will stand beside me in the morning and make plain that the law protects the poor when the palace fails to." That cost the minister something. He paid it with a small stiffening of the neck and a nod that would look like agreement if described to those who had not seen it. The old noble cleared his throat, a dry sound like the turning of an old hinge. "Her presence," he said, glancing at Inez, then away the way men do when they are learning a new kind of manners, "will require cover." "In my house," the housekeeper answered before any man could. "There are cloaks for weather you cannot forecast. I will fetch one." She rose, her keys speaking for her, and left and returned so quickly the draught at the door barely cooled, before she warmed it again. She draped the cloak over Inez's shoulders with a touch quick as a sparrow. Alejandro noticed that small domestic mercy and filed it where he kept the memory of useful people. He addressed Inez without making it soft. "You will not return to the hall," he said. "You will wait in the side room until I come." The steward looked pained at being instructed in his own house. The minister looked relieved to have the girl contained somewhere he could locate. The old noble looked older. The captain settled like a man who knew where his men would stand while the night finished being itself. Inez nodded. "Yes, Your Highness." He caught the way the chain shone against the dark of the cloak and felt, for an unguarded breath, the urge to move his hand toward it as a man might to test the temperature of water before drinking. He kept his hands on the table's edge, knuckles white, the old cure for impulses that lead to stories other people tell. "You spoke of the South," he said, words for her and for the paper and for the men who would carry them out of the room. "Of a woman who left in the night. If there is more to say that belongs to the morning, keep it. If there is more to say that belongs only to you, keep that tighter." She looked at him as if he had spoken an impossible language, and she understood every word. "There is more," she said, voice bare as a hand. "And there is less than they will want." "Then we will use what we have," he said, "and let what we don't burn itself out." The minister, to his credit, did not balk at being treated as one piece on a board someone else had set. "At first light," he said, "the audience gallery." Alejandro nodded. "With the ledgers, with the box, with what we say agreeing with what we do." Wax cooled. The clerk sprinkled sand, breathed on the page, tapped it clean. The housekeeper's keys rattled in a softer register now. The old noble looked down at his hands as if surprised to still have them. The steward tried one last bit of his old life. "Your Highness," he said, timid and greedy at once, "shall I remove the girl through the service stairs to avoid—" "No," Alejandro said. "She will use the corridor reserved for musicians. People can watch a person pass without deciding they own the path." The minister caught the word people with a tiny twitch and let it go. The captain of the guard assigned one of his quieter men to stand at the side room's door without looking like he stood there. He did it with a nod that said he had guarded worse and better for ends he had not liked and had not spoken of. Alejandro gathered the pendulum of the night with 2 hands and held it still. "We are done here," he said. "For now." He lifted the box. He set the lid into its curve of wood with care. He handed it to the clerk, who clutched it as if it contained a small animal that might bolt. He took the ledger and left the original on the table as if to prove possession did not always mean theft. He glanced once more at Inez, at the curve of the cloak over her shoulders, at the light resting just so on the silver in her palm. He let himself imagine, for the length of one candle gutter, a room where no one else stood and air that did not weigh so much. "Wait," he said again, softer now, and she gave him the smallest nod a room like this could bear. They opened the door. The dance beyond went on with its new, deliberate brightness, a performance put on for itself. The court was trying to remember how to be a court. The musicians remembered a phrase they could trust. The crowd remembered how to pretend. Alejandro stepped through first, the minister at his shoulder, the clerk and the box in their wake, the captain falling into the river of feet with a current that took his men where they needed to be. The steward bowed, late and low, to the wrong thing again. The antechamber's cool stayed behind like the aftertaste of a strong drink. Ahead, candles, mirrors, the long night, and a morning he had decided would be met with open hands and paper that would not lie. He did not look back because looking back invites doubt. He kept his breath measured, and the room, for once, matched him. The side room held quiet like water in a jar. It tasted of beeswax and stone. A single candle leaned in its cup and gave a steady flame. Inés sat where the prince had told her to sit and listened to the palace breathe. It had a different breath at night, long and careful, as if using someone else's lungs. Her hands lay still in her lap. The chain pooled in her palm. The pendant warmed against the skin that had worn it since girlhood. Every so often she turned it with her thumb, not enough to make light jump, just enough to feel the nick that matched a piece she had not seen since a woman told her a story, and left with the dark. The housekeeper came and went, keys saying what mouths couldn't. Once she set a cup of water on the table and pushed it closer. "Drink," she said. "You don't want to climb morning with a dry mouth." Inez drank, the cool hitting the back of her throat in a way that made her eyes sting for a heartbeat. "Thank you." "Don't thank me for what I can do," the housekeeper said. "Save it for when I can't and try anyway." She adjusted the cloak on Inez's shoulders, quick and practical, then looked at the door and lowered her voice. "You can still decide to refuse the morning. And then the morning will decide for you." Inez set the cup down with care. "It has already decided for most of my life. I think I will try the other way." The housekeeper's mouth twitched toward a smile it didn't have permission to be. "Stay on your feet then. Men with pens get dizzy when women don't fall." Footsteps softened the corridor. A pause at the door. A knock not meant to ask, only to say I am here. The door opened and closed. The room straightened. He did not fill it with noise. He brought a colder draught than the antechamber had kept at bay, a scent of night and metal, of a person who had walked through rooms made of eyes. He stood a few paces from her chair and let the candle paint his face with lines. "At dawn," he said. 2 words, plain. The kind of promise that can crush or carry. She looked up. "Will there be enough light?" "There will be enough watching." He glanced at the box in the clerk's arms, then at the ledger under the clerk's hand. He did not look at the pendant. He did not look at her too long. "Have you slept?" "No." "Good," he said, and a corner of his mouth thought about something human. "Neither have they." He left as he had come, voice a movement and not a demand. The door closed in a private way. The housekeeper sighed and leaned a hip against the table, as if the wood might share the burden. "Stand a moment," she said. "When you sit too long waiting, your legs forget you need them." Inez stood. The cloak slid into place. The pendant lay quiet. A thought rose and sat. When they speak my name this morning, it will go somewhere it has not gone before. She let the thought sit. She did not touch it again. The corridor brightened the smallest amount. The candle did not need to prove itself against the dark. The palace's night ground toward day with a stubbornness that matched hers. Somewhere far off, a bell that counted the hours tapped one, then was ashamed of making noise and stopped. He had chosen the audience gallery because it did not intoxicate. Alejandro wanted stone and long lines, not chandeliers and applause. He walked its length with the captain, measuring space as if planning a drill. Windows bleached from black to ash. The clerks lit candles where the gray had not yet reached. Wax puddled into useful circles. "Tables here?" he said, and the captain moved men with his chin. "Not too close. I don't want anyone saying we crowded a truth to make it look bigger." He looked over his shoulder and caught the steward. "Bring the ledgers," he said to the clerk instead, "and the box." The minister arrived with his green-coated guards and a face set to appear neutral in oil paint. He inclined his head enough to pass muster. "Your Highness," he said, "we are prepared." "We are preparing," Alejandro corrected. He took his place at the central table, not in the chair raised on the small dais that had stretched the power of men before him. He stood at the level where words crossed and stuck. The nobles bled into the room from 3 doors at once, their colors muted for daylight dignity. The old noble found a seat without being told where to sit. He had learned the geography of moments like this before Alejandro learned to hold a sword. The housekeeper took her place where women are not usually placed, with her keys heavy and her jaw set. Alejandro's eye found the steward hovering and pinned him with work. "Send for the goblet from the high table," he said. The steward blinked at the oddity of it, and then ran, grateful to be forgotten while he was useful. The clerk opened the box. The key turned with a low, satisfying sound. The fragment lay inside like a crescent of winter sun. He set it on the table next to the pendant's empty space. "Let them see," Alejandro said. He wanted their recognition to be born from evidence and not from fear. Footsteps in the corridor announced her. The captain did not need to see to know it was her. Rooms register certain people differently when they enter. Alejandro kept his face as unforgiving as ever. He did not need his court to see what he was learning. He needed them to see that he had chosen how to use his hands today. "Stand her here," the minister murmured to a guard, and then corrected himself, tempering command with show. "If she pleases, she can stand here." "She will stand where I ask," Alejandro said. Not cruel, exact. He indicated a place beside the ledgers. He let the space be what it was. Not a servant's corner, not a queen's chair, something invented for this hour. When she took it, he felt the gallery take its true shape. The work could begin. She had never stood where words were weighed and not just thrown. Inez felt the stone under her shoes and the cool that came off it. The room was not golden, it was stern.
It had been designed to make men listen to what they said aloud.
She glanced once at the prince, and then at the table. His hands were on the wood the way a person steadies a boat before stepping into it. The minister looked at the paper as if it might break into singed edges if treated roughly. The old noble looked at her because he no longer had permission not to. The clerk coughed into his fist and began to read in a thin, disciplined voice. He read the page whose line had been scraped and written over, and whose ghost still spoke. He read the princess consort's name with the care people use for the dead. He read the notation about the pendant given as a door-opener for those the city would not let in. He read the month the river bit the south without showing teeth, and the year when night deliveries did more good than speeches. The minister stepped in at the right places, sprinkling the words with state. The late princess consort acted under the discretion afforded to her office, he said. The household officers... He let the sentence hang. The household officers were present, their titles pressed into their coats, their fear. Alejandro gestured to the housekeeper. Say what you carried, he asked, the asking a gift and a charge. She lifted her chin. Bread. Linen. A midwife who didn't ask questions. A message to stay indoors for 3 nights, not because the city was bloodthirsty, but because gossip is. A silver oval put into a woman's hand with the instruction not to sell it even when everything else was gone. Whose hand? The minister said. A widow's, the housekeeper said. Her husband died in the south when the bridges fell and people argued whose fault it was instead of passing buckets. He died with his boots on and no pension because someone in this house, she did not point, lost the paper at the bottom of a stack when it mattered most. An old murmur shook itself awake in the gallery. It had the sound of "It wasn't me" and "I remember nothing" dressed in daylight. The old noble put a knuckle to his mouth as if to hold back a word he had never wanted to learn. The minister glanced at a thin file in his clerk's hand and chose to be honest enough. A petition was lodged and set aside, he said, misfiled. The word said accident. His face said a man made the accident and did not pay for it. Inez kept her eyes on the wood grain. She spoke without warning herself. He had a name, she said. They usually do. Silence adjusted itself around the new fact that her voice belonged here. The minister made a small gesture that could be read as invitation. If you have it. I have it, she said, and did not give it to them. And I have a mother who learned to smile at officials so that numbers would look like help and not like stones. Alejandro heard the line and let it stay. He did not demand details to make the court feel it had eaten its fill. He knew when enough is enough. The clerk reached for the fragment in the box and paused. He looked to the prince, to the minister, to the housekeeper. He looked lastly to her. It surprised him that this last look mattered. Alejandro picked up the pendant. He held it at a height where the men in the second row could see and the women could watch without standing. He did not look at her when he did it, and then he did. Do you permit? He asked. It might have been the first time anyone in that room had used that verb in her direction. She nodded once. The room took breath the way people do when they see a small change and do not yet know if it will get to be a bigger one. He brought the fragment to the nick, and for an instant held it there without letting it bite. He felt the pulled muscle that comes from restraint and liked the ache better than the lunge. Watch, the minister said to the room, the word humble for once because it faced something that did not need his help. The two pieces met. The fit was exact in a way that made talk unnecessary. Watching, the gallery exhaled. The old noble's eyes closed for the length of a prayer he had forgotten. The housekeeper let go of her keys with her hand, and they thumped once and went quiet. Alejandro did not seal the join. He did not need glue. The truth had weight enough. He held the completed symbol where light could find it, and then lowered it and set it in Inez's hand. Keep it where it belongs, he said. It belonged, she realized, not because a palace said so, but because a woman had put it there first with a purpose the palace had nearly ruined. The minister unfolded a statement. The clerk straightened his back. The sentence they had crafted together in ink began its life in air. "By agreement of the household and the state," the minister said, his rhythm clean, careful. "The pendant is affirmed as the token of lawful protection extended by the late princess consort to those without other shield. The ledger is corrected in the sight of those present. The household officers accept censure for conduct that increased risk to a person under that protection." A scrape of chair legs marked a noble's dislike. He masked it as discomfort and failed. Alejandro stepped in before the minister could close the book. He was not reading now. He was deciding in public and living with what that meant. "Last night," he said, "I measured obedience with noise. If I had continued, you would have clapped and told the story with the names rearranged to flatter yourselves." A vibration ran through the gallery. A few eyes dropped, not out of modesty. "Today," he went on, "I choose to be measured by the air we all have to breathe. If the poor cannot breathe here, then we suffocate whether we know it or not." He turned his head toward the steward, not cruel, exact again. "You used your small authority as if it were a cudgel. I will not have it. You will not speak where work should." He did not say the man's punishment. He did not need to. Consequences are loudest when they do not gossip. He turned back to the minister. "And you will sign this page," he said. "Not because I ask, because it is the law you claim." The minister signed with a hand steadier than his mouth. "It is signed," he said, and that too mattered. Alejandro addressed the room. "I will not dress this as romance or fairy tale. A woman set a goblet in front of me when I shouted, 'No one silences me.' She silenced me without a word. She put a mirror on my table and made me see more than my face." A flush moved through Inez. Not shame. Heat that gathered at the sternum where fear had lived and changed its name. "If you must tell this," he said to the nobles who would tell it no matter what he said, "tell it straight. Say I would have done wrong and chose not to. Say a servant's exactness corrected a prince's vanity. Say the house she serves in will not smother the next person who stands where she stood." The gallery did not applaud. It did something rarer and more useful. It understood where not to push. The steward returned with the silver goblet held in two hands, as if it were a relic. He set it on the table with a clink that remembered the night. Alejandro curled his fingers around it and lifted, not to toast, to make a different kind of use. He did not look past the faces. He looked at the one face that had held him without permission, hers. He did not cross the space by reaching for her hand. He crossed it with what he set down. He placed the goblet between them, not at his place, not at hers, between. "Drink," he said, and for once it was a generosity and not an order. She did not look for permission elsewhere. She wrapped her hand around the stem, felt the warmth his fingers had left, and lifted. The water struck her tongue and took every sharp edge out of her mouth. She lowered the cup and did not place it in front of him. She moved it a finger's width and left it exactly between them. A murmur flickered, then died. People who had come wanting spectacle witnessed instead a choreography they could not imitate, respect heavier than gold lace, tenderness that did not embarrass itself by begging to be seen. He did not touch her. He touched the space their act had made. The clerk closed the ledger with the care due to a sleeping child. The minister bowed a degree deeper and meant it more than he had in the hall. The housekeeper's mouth let the smile arrive and stay. "Speak," Alejandro said, and looked at Inez the way one looks at a landscape before drawing it. She remembered gutters and apprentices' jokes, and the taste of orange peel sucked after it had been used to scent someone else's wine. She remembered the weight of a pendant under coarse linen. She remembered a boy who once stole her shoe and returned it after she told him a story in which he was brave. She let those voices assemble into one. "I was taught," she said, "that noise from the poor is punished by hunger, and silence is rewarded by being invisible." The room leaned to catch the next line. "Last night I carried a cup to a man who said no one silences him. I believed it, because I have seen how quickly rooms like that make people disappear. But the cup had to be set down. If I had stood still with it, I would have been a statue in a corner until I died. She could feel him listening, as if each word tightened a new knot he wanted to keep. "I do not want your pity," she said simply. "It is food that turns bitter in the mouth." "What do you want?" the minister asked, genuinely, because asking costs less than assuming. "For the people who clean this house to walk in it without holding their breath," she said. "For the next girl who carries a thing into light to be given a chair and not a hand at her elbow." The old noble, who had buried things and now watched one unearth itself without asking for permission, made a small sound that could have been grief or the first cough after a sickness breaks. Alejandro nodded once. "That," he said, and turned to the steward with a look that made the man taller and smaller at once. "Write the instruction, and then live it." "I will, Your Highness," the steward said, and shockingly, the sentence had the shape of truth. The minister lifted the signed page. "This will be read to the household," he said, "and copied for the records." "Good," Alejandro said. He positioned himself not in front of Inés, not behind her, beside. For a moment the room disappeared. Not literally, not carelessly. It softened its edges the way stone does when water has its way for 100 years. In that softened moment, he looked at her from the side and let the humor's ghost return to his mouth. "You set a cup in front of me," he said. "I will spend a lifetime learning how to put one down the way you did." "I will let you practice," she said. And it was a line no one in the gallery could pretend not to hear. He did not ask for her hand. He did something harder. He left the goblet where it was and turned to the people who had come to measure him. He did not ask for applause. He did not wait for permission. "Go," he said to the room, and it understood that meant more than leave. "Go and do not pretend you did not see this." One by one, with the brittle grace of people learning a new step, they went. Some bowed to him. A few bowed to her. Most pretended the sun in the east had demanded their attention. It had. It had finally earned it. When the gallery thinned to practical people and air, he let his shoulders slide away from their tight habit. He reached for the goblet and stopped, his fingers hovering. "Together," he said. She covered the stem with her hand and felt his knuckles near without touching. The cup steadied in the exact middle. They lifted it a breath and set it down again with a soft click that made a mark without leaving a bruise. Light came in at an angle finally honest enough to show dust in the air. Dust made gold when struck properly. The goblet took the light and gave it back without hoarding. The pendant lay on her skin where it had lain all her life, heavier now for having been seen and not taken. The prince and the woman stood shoulder to shoulder while the city woke, and the silver between them remembered what it had learned in 2 rooms. Power when held too tight is brittle. When shared, it holds. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.